Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you. So I was saying in this literature review that was recently published, they called for more emphasis on the complexity of these relationships. They also identified co-creation of value as one of the most promising avenues of future research. And in particular, they also state that it's relevant for us as researchers to give more voice to marginalized or vulnerable stakeholders who tend to be less powerful than some other groups that we have been doing research about. And in this research, we followed their definition of stakeholder engagement, which comprises not only the objectives or the aims of engagements, but also the activities and the impacts of these activities on the stakeholders and the organizations. And especially also they highlight three components, which are the moral, strategic, and the pragmatic, which are also influencing all these elements of engagement. And again, well, the fact that these relationships are complex, and one interesting fact is that we and in the practice also we are following a more homogeneous perspective on the stakeholders, while they are in fact individuals with names and faces. Just to give you an overview of the methodology, we have stated this question that is guiding the analysis of the case. And the idea is to try to understand how do these components, the moral, strategic, and pragmatic, shape the process of value co-creation in this relationship with the stakeholders. We believe that the case study methodology allows us to really approach the phenomenon while also taking into account the context in which the phenomenon takes place. And also because in terms of the selection of the case, we believe that this case provides a lot of diversity, so it will be a rich case to draw many theoretical conclusions later. And the data sources are interviews, secondary data, but we expect also to collect primary data and more interviews from the stakeholders themselves in the following months. So let me tell you a little bit more about Carla Fernandez, which is the, let's say, the company that we are in contact with, and that has enabled us to get access to the case. So they are a fashion house here in Mexico. This company was established in 2000 as an itinerant fashion lab to enable the designer and one of the founders to approach the communities of artisans in the textile industry here in Mexico. And they collaborate nowadays with artisans from 27 different communities with different techniques of work with the textile. The work that they do, the designs have been presented at international fashion shows in London, New York Fashion Week, and others. Something interesting is that they have a threefold purpose. So they want to reduce the economic poverty in artisans communities. More than 60% of the artisans here in Mexico, not only in the textile industry, but in other industries, they live in conditions of poverty. So one of their purposes is to take them out of these conditions. Another part of their purpose is to stop the extinction of artisan textiles because the artisans are living under poverty. Then some of them are forced to leave their households and to dedicate themselves to other activities. So in that sense, the transfer of these handcraft and these techniques is not necessarily coming to other generations. So we're losing this cultural heritage. And finally, well, they want to transform the fashion industry into a more just system without oppression and in more harmony with the environment. So these are a few facts around the company. I wish that I had more time to discuss that, but since I'm running out of time, I just wanted to present very few of the preliminary findings. We found that this structure provided by Kujal and colleagues has enabled us to bring more understanding, to organize the findings that we are getting from the case, and I will just name a few of them. For instance, in the aims of the engagement activities or the engagement with the stakeholders. As I have spoken, the purpose of the company and the purpose of the people who are working in these companies to improve the living conditions of the artisans, right? And on the other opposite extreme, on the strategic objective, well, the company wouldn't exist, their designs wouldn't exist without the co-creation, and the feasibility of their business model wouldn't be there if they don't have this relationship and these exchanges with the stakeholders. In terms of activities, in terms of the moral component, we identified the personal relationship that is established with the artisans, right? And just to also give you an idea of the pragmatic component in terms of the activities, the company adapts all the processes to the realities, the capabilities, and the knowledge also that they get from the artisans themselves. They have to adapt, for example, the technical notes. They send a package. I will just briefly give you an overview of the process, but they send a package with technical notes, and the way that they do that is by taking into account whether the artisans, whether they speak Spanish. Some of them speak indigenous languages, so they have to be able to adapt their processes of work to make the solutions work for everyone. And on the strategic part, they do community visits and training that is also aiming to enable the exchange with the stakeholders. And I will skip the impact because I only have 1 minute. And here I also, this was something that emerged from recent discussions with my colleague. The idea was also to identify in this process of value co-creation, the designs come back and forth. As you can see here, there's a sample. For example, here the company sends a production kit. The samples come from the artisans, and then they do quality checks. So we see that different components, the strategic, pragmatic, and the moral, they come and emerge at different stages of the process of value co-creation and in the engagement with the stakeholders. So conclusions, what we are getting from these preliminary results is that engagement components seems to be closely connected to one another, and they might be interdependent. So sometimes the pragmatic component enables also the strategic, for example, aims, and also the moral. And there are many slight and subtle differences between all these elements, right, and how they are manifested and expressed in the aims, activities, and the impacts. And as I mentioned, well, the components emerge at different stages. And we believe that also the company and the members of the company, they give different levels of priority to these different components while they are engaging with the stakeholders. So in this sense, the purpose of the company is like a kind of a compass to assign these priority levels to all the components, right? And definitely moral considerations are essential to overcome, and this echoes past research. And heterogeneity well calls for the adaptation of the organization to fit the context and the conditions of the stakeholders. Finally, potential contributions. We believe that we can contribute to the literature by extending the engagement, the engagement work by highlighting the interplay between all these components, the moral, the pragmatic, and the strategic, and how they are expressed in slightly different manners throughout these engagement processes and value co-creations. And this will also enable us to bring more understanding of how and when engagement enables us to create value for vulnerable stakeholders, and highlighting also the heterogeneity. So thank you. I think I stole 1 minute from the feedback, but we are really open to your comments and suggestions of where should we focus on, or what could be the avenues and potential contributions of this research, not only in terms of academic community, but also we would like to give also some contributions to the practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christiana. Very interesting case study. So, colleagues, the floor is open. You can put up your hand to engage Christiana. Whilst we're waiting for you to gather your thoughts, I think it's a lovely way to talk about relationality and the ongoing relationality. and how they create each other. So I really like it. If you're looking
Thank
for
you.
another case, we could easily find one in South Africa.
Oh, thank you very much. Looking forward to also
Mhm.
any comments on the chat later on.
I was also about to ask if you're planning on running similar analysis on other cases. I think it would be very interesting to compare that also to other contexts, as Kushik was just highlighting.
We haven't considered that yet, but my colleague is also doing some research in Africa in the following days. That's why he couldn't be with us. And we have also identified other cases of vulnerable communities. For example, there's a case that we are familiar with, and they work in the manufacturing of bicycles with people who are in the process of reinsertion, right? So they have been in jails, in this kind of I don't know how to call them because there's a not exact translation from Spanish, but young people who are in let's say reinsertion processes because they have gotten in trouble with the law, right?
Yeah, I think it's so fundamental in emerging economies in particular, where you find the cultural heritage has no opportunities for commercial development. And I think what you're providing is a very pragmatic framework to think about possibilities to get that energized. So yeah, it's exciting, both theoretically and practically.
Thank you.
Yeah. So no other questions for Caroline. There's one from Maura. I forgot the name right. Please go ahead, Maura.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a very nice insight of how you went about your research, which is helpful for, I think, people who are starting your PhD. I just wanted to ask you a question is about the relationship that was created. Was it out of pressure or because the company itself wanted to have this initiative and getting involved with society? Because sometimes when you think about we think about stakeholder pressure, that's why we respond to stakeholder pressure, or is it like a personal initiative from the case study that you studied, they took the initiatives?
Yeah, thank you, Maura. That's an interesting question. I couldn't talk more, but and perhaps this could also be something that we need to highlight. But the history, the background of the founder herself, it calls for this relationship already with the indigenous communities. The admiration that she feels for their work is something that was there even before the company was created. And nowadays, I think like it has evolved, right? Because at first it was the let's say her as a designer looking for the artisan communities, but nowadays they also get contacted by the artisans community because of social media exposure. They also are brought together in artisan fairs. So there are many ways in which they are initiating contact, let's say. But this is something, a point that we will definitely try to understand better during the second phase of data collection. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I think we can give Christiana a round of applause.
Thank you.
I think it's great to see such interesting work. So we have our next speaker, Cynthia Akwe. I hope I've got that right. We can't hear you at the moment.
You are muted.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, thank you for having me. I need to share my slides. Have I been given the opportunity to?
Yes, you have. Sure.
Wait, just a minute. I'll just open. And it's on slideshow. Can you see my slides?
Not yet.
Okay, then I need to share. Just a second. All right. I'm trying to share my screen.
Yeah, there's this share screen button at the bottom. Yes.
So many things. Oh dear. Just a second. I have to find the.
Do you have only one screen or more?
Only one.
Okay.
But I think I have opened. I opened this. Just a minute. Oh dear.
So when you click on the share screen button, like all windows that you have opened should automatically appear there. And
Yeah, it has.
And you can click on your presentation. Is it there?
It's not showing in here, so I need to go back and see why, because I opened it before coming into. Okay, just a minute. Let's see. Right, can you see it now?
Not yet.
I should. Just a minute. I think it should work this time. Oh dear, this is, maybe I have to share without showing because it's not showing there. I don't know why. It normally does.
Yes.
Okay, I found it.
Yes.
Yes.
Do we see it?
There you are.
Yes.
Right. So my name is, can I start now?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Please, you can start, Sandy. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, right then. So my research was looking at integrating stakeholders engagement strategy into existing a new social value strategy in developing economies. The reason why this research was basically to look at what is going on when it comes to stakeholders engagement, because a lot of the literatures don't show how stakeholders engagement is being integrated into social value creation. Now, these are the outlines that I would share with you. I don't want to go through it because of time. Why did I choose this topic and why am I studying this? There is increasing attention on public goods and stakeholders engagement, which fits into sustainability on that. And we find a lot of ineffective public social value creation in terms of projects and corruption, financial loss within developing countries. And in this case, I picked Ghana, for instance, because when it comes to social values, a lot of times these are presented in government projects and programs. Now, although we have the programs and projects going on, what is the engagement of stakeholders in terms of the beneficiaries of the social value that is being created? What is the participation, right? And I wanted to see how we can engage, because it looks, and this came of one of my research that I had that shows that engagement is really at the low point within the public social value creation, and also key issues with transparency and accountability. So those were the key things that led to this research. So what are my objectives that I focus on in the research question? I wanted to find out what the stakeholders engagement process is in public projects for providing social value in Ghana. So, and to also examine, the aim is to also examine stakeholders engagement process in public projects. Now, 4 key objectives helped me to be able to achieve my research aim and then answer the questions. So the first one was to explore current engagement processes. What are the successes? What are the failures? I went on to identify barriers. Could they be institutional or context-based? And I also looked at ways of how to integrate stakeholders in this value, social value creation. And finally, to develop a framework. So those are the key objectives that I looked at. Now, theoretical underpinning for my work basically is to look at sustainable development and sustainability. So I'm looking at Elkington 1999, Brundtland report 1987, to look at triple bottom line, economic, social, environmental, and then social value creation strategy. The second part was to use the stakeholders theory and stakeholders management and engagement theory. And that I have already developed a framework of search for political stakeholders engagement. So I was looking at how I can extend it into the social value creation. I have Jeffrey 2009, Freeman 1984 to actually talk about it. Michelle et al. 1987. So these were the theoretical backgrounds that I used for my study. Now, I am not going to go into these because I don't have too much time, as I've said. Social value creation is important in developing countries because most of the time we have needs that the public or the citizens have needs that has to be provided by government, right? Leading, and this value, the benefits that they are looking for in terms of social utilities, etc., comes in the form of projects and programs. So what is it that we are looking for? Now, I moved on to look at the stakeholders engagement because that is the whole structure of the research. So defining stakeholders and understanding it, but then the key thing is what is stakeholders engagement? And I have used a definition that I coined when I was doing the political stakeholders engagement, looking at engagement is defined as a process of continuous inclusiveness, encompassing a range of activities, approaches that can affect the lifespan of a project and programs with the aim of building better relationships to bring about changes that improves direction, legitimacy, voice, performance, accountability, and fairness, equity when it comes to social value creation. So I have all these aspects here, but then what I did was to first, before I can talk about engagement, I have to look at who the stakeholders are. So I use the stakeholders mapping to identify who the stakeholders of public projects and programs, which leads to social value creation are. And I use Michelle et al. 1987 approach to do that. Now, on this side, you will find who the the customers are, who the latent customers are, stakeholders are, who the expectant stakeholders are, and the definitive stakeholders. But then key amongst this is that it is the beneficiaries. So when we go back into this, you see the needy ones is the definite customers who have all the three legitimacies. The dominants are not actually part, you know, they actually have the legitimacy and they have the power, but the agency is not there. The dormant didn't really matter, discretionary didn't matter, but we have demanding stakeholders who are activists. They don't have all the legitimacy, they have the agency, but they don't have the legitimacy and the power. But most important are the dangerous stakeholders, the dependent stakeholders, and the definitive group within this sector. So those are the ones that we concentrated on. They might have two of the characteristics or three, all of them. Now, I looked at the type, the time is not too on my side. So when I look at stakeholders and engagement type, I was not only looking at the consultation approach, but I was looking at the shared accountability. So responsibility involving learning, making decisions, and drawing up actions with responsibility. It's a two-way relationship. That is what I was looking at. Because most of the time, what we find is the consultation, which is just the push and pull approach, consultation approach, sometimes participation, which is very limited. But I wanted to look at also having responsibility within this engagement. So the partnership was the key one that I took. These are the methods that I use in the research. So qualitative approach using phenomenology based on what they tell me, the perceptions or the key values or the key experiences, of the participants. And I also use documentary evidence to support it. Data collection, when I was going to sample, was purposive. Sampling was purposive. 5 years implementation using snowballing, 32 participants. And then I use the face-to-face semi-structured interviews and analyze the data using thematic analysis. Now the framework, the first finding, which is what is in place currently and how do we improve it? So currently you can see that in Ghana, the stakeholders engagement process is not well defined, not formalized. It's used as a tokenism approach, tick box, right? Some people don't even practice it in the project and programs approach. Low public participation, the public or the beneficiaries who are the citizens don't even know that they have a right to be able to do it. Some of them is apathy, very apathic. Now, institutionally, I identify barriers. So because there is no formal structures, it's very difficult to practice it. Insufficient understanding of what it means to add stakeholders, engage them, right? And even implement them. Now, lack of experience, personnel to even work on that. Lack of decentralized governance, everything is centralized. Corruption is at the key point. So everyone is looking at ways of making money or social value creation rather than giving of benefits. Abuse of power, victimization, when you talk about things that are not working. Lack of authority to carry up with this engagement process. Now we look at other barriers. Culture was one, right? The culture has been created such that we don't include stakeholders. We don't talk about it. People are apathic. They don't really care. Lack of awareness, lack of patriotism, lack of civic education, and corruption is at the highest level. So when I was going through talking to participants and asking for feedback in terms of that, how do we make it better? How do we integrate it? Key things that came up here was that there should be a policy that should be developed, practice framework. There should be vision objectives, standards of engagement should be instituted. It should be part of the core values of the organizations when they are developing their strategy. They needed internal structures that should be used, monitoring and evaluation. But then the key thing that resonated with me when I collected the data and analyzed that is, I met some people who are ready to do the right thing, yet they are victimized. So here, developing and rewarding champions for bringing out, calling out corruption and making sure that people are engaged in the stakeholders are engaged in the process. Now, if you look at the key framework that I have developed here, these things that are going on at the moment, the three things leads to poor engagement. But then these are ways that we can develop or it can be improved to lead to an integrated engagement strategy. Meeting goods and services needs, value for money, positive outcome in terms of economic, social, and environmental. Now, that is what I have found. But then if I'm talking about the framework, it's my time, okay? If I'm talking about my framework, then I have developed this.
Yeah, I think you've got a last 2 minutes, Cynthia,
Okay.
if you can wrap up, thank you.
All right, great. So this is the integrated approach that I have developed based on, stakeholders engagement. And I have 7 key stages that public or governments, public institutions can use. Developing vision and vision objectives, understanding the stakeholders like I have done, trying to understand their interest and influence. Also, being able to internally prepare public projects and alignment to engage. So at the beginning of it, building trust. This is one thing that I found very important. Being able to build trust with the different project stakeholders. Involving consultation. Consultation here, remember, is the partnership approach. So we are looking at relationship building. And then both all the stakeholders going to develop, respond to sustainable project actions. And finally, there should be monitoring and evaluation. And the cyclical approach goes on to ensure that at every point in time, all the sustainable aspects are engaged, embedded in the process, and also stakeholders are actively engaged and participate and be responsible for public projects. I think I'll end here. I have contributions, so I'll talk about that because my time is fast. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you. A really interesting study. And you can hear from the passionate voice that presents it that this is a meaningful study too. I think we have probably a minute for any questions, and we can probably share feedback with Cynthia on the chat. So if anybody would like to go, we have time for one question. Please, Christiana.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Cynthia, for your interesting presentation. I was wondering about like if you were able to get the perspective of the government, because I see also a potential struggle in the distrust of skepticism from the stakeholders, right? And I don't know, even hidden aims from the government, like we see here all the time, they're only thinking about like re-election or like getting more power. So I wonder if you were able to get the government's perspective, and how are you also addressing these struggles between the two different sides?
Yeah, so thank you very much. The stakeholders that I interviewed were both from the government side, the consultants, the participants, the contractors, and also the public. So I have all the stakeholders. As I said, if you look at the stakeholders mapping, I have identified all of them in it. So governments told us everything is going on normal. We have no problem. We are providing social care and everyone is fine. But then when I go into the different people, even within the government, asking them how this is going on, that's where you identify key barriers that are in place. So what I did was to analyze it, looking at what government is telling me, whether that is what is in existence. Remember, I used documentary evidence. So I got them to give me some of their strategies, some of their papers, and majority of them is that they tick the box, but it's not actually represented. So.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you. I think we can give Cynthia a round of applause for her lovely presentation. And good luck with your further development of the work, Cynthia. Our next speaker is Rashid Hassan. I hope I've got the name pronounced correctly. Rashid.
Good, it's good, Rashid.
Yes, and so we have Rashid. Do you want to have share slides with us?
Yes, I'm going to share my screen.
So while Rashid is doing that, he's talking to us about the Stakeholder Value Creation Index.
Can I see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful.
You may go ahead. You have 10 minutes, and then I'll put my hand up when you've got there.
Sounds good. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'm delighted to be here. I have my colleague, Lisa Green-Pemble. Actually, she's in a separate track, so she can't join me. And then we also have two industry partner, Mike Sine from Bain & Company and Harun Assad from Genentech, but I'm not sure that they're able to join. I think there's some timing mismatch. So I will carry the burden myself, and hopefully we can do justice to this presentation together with your feedback. So basically the issue is in ESG versus SBI. SBI is a stakeholder value index that we have developed at George Mason University. ESG is obviously, it's the center stage of many of the metrics being used by investors, but questions and skepticism remains. There are close to 600 plus ESG metrics out there around the world and 70 plus provider. But these metrics are at times very inconsistent, and there have been many studies done to show that the same company is rated differently by different providers, and that creates confusion in the mind of investors. Also, ESG metrics is, to our mind, is a subset of measures that are really needed to understand stakeholder capitalism. ESG is also focused on risk assessment as opposed to risk mitigation. And ESG is obviously a focus for investors. It's not very useful for other stakeholders. The proposed SBA framework, I actually made a presentation in the last colloquium last year on the framework itself, so I'm going to spend much time on that. But it's basically we're thinking about all the stakeholders, that should be included, and we have 7 stakeholders that I will share one slide in the next. We want to ensure that the framework and the metrics have wider appeal and usefulness to all the stakeholders, not just the shareholders. And then the metrics drives the need for transparency and conversation around business purpose, policy implication, research need, and educational imperative. So this framework that we put together, which has sort of 7 stakeholders, and then for each stakeholder we have a set of categories that I'm not going to go into much detail today, but we are actually testing the framework, SBI framework, and Visa with ESG, just to make sure that our assessments are at least aligned, and if where there may be contrary to ESG, so that we can get a sense of reasonableness test. Also, it's based on the data that should be available as opposed to what's available, because a lot of time you compromise in the way you measure companies because the data isn't available. We're saying, okay, let's think about what data should be made available and drive the conversation as to why the data isn't available and what can be done from a policy perspective and other ways to bring those data into reality. Also, the claim versus reality needs to be factually discerned from data analytics, and also bring to the forefront some questions like, when we measure ESG effectiveness, we look at the traditional discounted cash flow, we have evaluating company performance, and I think in many ways SBI is challenging. Is that the right approach for how we create, estimate value of company in society? In the same token, we're looking at some of the metrics around human capital, and one of the major challenges, why is human capital not in the balance sheets? If you consider human being employees, one of the key assets for the company. The data we've been collecting to date is for the Fortune 100 companies. And if you look at the Fortune 100 companies as a cohort, it's quite phenomenal. If you just think about it, they collectively controls $33.3 trillion of asset, which is bigger than the US GDP. They generate $9.8 trillion in revenue, which is twice the size of US budget. Just to give you a sense of comparison, they employ about 12 million people, creates about 1.1 trillion in net profit or wealth, if you want to say it that way. But that wealth is not distributed evenly among all the various stakeholders. 80% of the net profit goes to the shareholders, which is one of the stakeholders. They generate almost 25% of the green gas emissions. Yet the climate change is focused around country and economies as opposed to these companies. Many of the employees in these companies have wages that are below living wages. So these are some of the challenges that we're trying to highlight as we collect the data and think about the implication. This SBI works already resulted in engagement in our classrooms, in our curriculum. We had ran a series of seminars over the last 2 years, and finally our faculty approved a new course in the business school. It's called Management 325, Value Creation for Business Stakeholders. It's a course that is available to the entire university as an elective. It satisfies business minor and the management concentration, and the class involves a lot of business executive coming into the classroom and jointly supporting student projects with an industry mentor. The effort is also very multidisciplinary. We've got faculty and the student in data analytics, computational science, data warehousing, data visualization. We even have faculty from law, public policy, economics, and public health who are proving the data and asking questions like, what can you do in terms of increasing data transparency through public policy? Is shareholder primacy a matter of law? It's a matter of perception. Is the market really free? And when you have economic theories developed based on free market, is it really giving us a result we're looking for? A lot of the business decisions are based on economies of scale. To what extent those theories really apply to business as well as to the economies. This SBI framework has been put together and being tested with industry partnership. Obviously, we have major driver behind this effort. I mean, in August 2019, the BRT Business Roundtable, right, 180 plus largest company CEOs made a statement that basically says stakeholder capitalism is something they need to be mindful of. Larry Fink of BlackRock, who, whose company controls about $10 trillion worth of asset as an institutional investors. He routinely sends out letters to CEOs to reassess the company's contribution to society. And there is a widespread acknowledgement that the Milton Friedman's sense of profit making as a purpose of the company is being seriously challenged and questioned. This framework, as I have indicated at the beginning, is also guided by industry expert, Mike Sion from a partner in Bain & Company, Harun Assad, a director of sustainability, Genentech. We also have other foundation nonprofit and public sector individual who are giving us some guidance in developing and framing this SPI. And as we launch this class and how to engage industry into the classroom to sort of advance stakeholder capitalism, from the beginning in terms of the young business leaders that we are educating in our classroom to make sure that they are mindful of those perspectives. So with that, I'm going to end and kind of open up for questions. So I may have given a little bit more than 5 minutes for Q&A, and that I really enjoy having that Q&A being the way to have the dialogue. So I'm open to a question.
Thank you, Rashad. You have 7 minutes, in fact, for dialogue. So probably Chris could ask his question directly. He's posted it in the chat if you have the chance to look.
I just wondered how far the recently adopted CSRD in Europe and European sustainability reporting standards, how far you feel they go in terms of addressing the gaps?
Yeah, so I think, right now we're, primarily have been focused on the SEC kind of guidelines in sort of thinking through what the company should be doing, at least from the US perspective. We have not taken a deep dive in some of the standards in Europe and others, and that's kind of the next step. We were right now trying to frame the SPI framework just to make sure that it's giving us meaningful results. And then in terms of some of the metrics, for example, in the US, when you look at employee well-being, we typically talk about living wages, even though the political dimension is around minimum wages, right? So we have been looking into what could be the benchmark or the standard, either already accepted or that are in conversation. So yeah, I think we have not gone there yet, but that's going to be the next stage of our evolution of the SPI framework.
Thanks for that, Chris and Rashad. We have one question more in the chat, but it's a longer question. I wonder if Jan would be able to express that question, because there's time.
Yes. Thank you, first of all, Rashad. I would very much read your research, if that's possible, if you can forward it, or maybe I can download it somewhere in a link. Yeah, indeed, a long question, and you don't have to answer all of them. But does the framework also have further opportunities to really look into barriers and maybe levers to facilitate the design, the organization of stakeholder engagement? And I really mean it in a broader view, maybe not only related to the topic of sustainability, but the overall stakeholder engagement idea.
Yeah, I think the SPI is in a way framed to have this broader conversation around each of the stakeholders. So, in our definition of the framework, we look at employee, the customer, the community, the supplier, the planet, and the shareholders, and the company itself. Because if the company isn't viable, then nothing else really matters. And so in that sense, we are, in some way, I would say we define sustainability more than just the environment. It's really about human condition on this planet, right? And that requires that business takes care of all the stakeholders in a very equitable way. And so we're framing the conversation and the data needs and the way we develop the metrics is that broader perspective. And I think there are some pushback, from industry and from other folks, but, we're basically saying, we're going to kind of put our stake on the ground and define it the way it should be defined. And then let's see what some of the challenges might be. So for example, right, in trying to assess whether the companies are paying employee a meaningful wage, the data is very scant. You really don't have meaningful data, right? On the other hand, I would say somebody is getting those data, for example, IRS, right, have data of every single individual in the US who files a tax return. And typically with the tax return, you also file a W-2 or W-1099, which is basically how much money you get from a company, right? So there's a way to look at the profile of wage profile, for example, from a company. Even the company are not disclosing those information. So the challenge is, can we launch research work in collaboration with IRS, the federal government, saying, okay, give us some of the data that we can then analyze and provide some more realistic perspective on what's really happening. Just as an example. So I think SBA framework is also pushing us to think differently and kind of opening up opportunities where you could do the additional research and engage industry, public, public, and even some of the nonprofit foundation who are very keen on this type of social equity that this SBI is trying to push for.
Thanks, Rashad. We have a commentary and a question by Rob, and I wish maybe Rob could express it because there's time for that.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. I think the question went something along the lines of, I agree with your point earlier around ESG and the variability of reporting, but there are a number of, but one option would be maybe to standardize and harmonize that, or there are a number of other options that are being talked about in the market, this included. From a CXO perspective or from an organizational perspective, how do you propose that an organization finds its way around the options when on one hand there's an urgency to do something, and on the other hand it's an embryonic market with lots of different options?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question, right? I mean, ESG sort of is moving at a fast pace, and institutional investors are basically saying, which one do I use to make any meaningful recommendation? And I don't think that market force is out there and it's evolving on its own term. I'm not sure that unless on the standard board and maybe even some policy to kind of guide how these things converge into something meaningful. In the absence of that, we thought from an academic institution, what can we bring to the table that is more holistic than ESG, and provide an alternative. And if there is value in what we're doing, and we can convince some of the companies whose data we're collecting to collaborate with us and share information, perhaps this becomes a complement to the ESG as opposed to a substitute. Also, I think, SBA is really geared towards, if I'm an employee or someone looking for a job, how do I really value a company? Looking at the ESG doesn't give me a lot of guidance. SBI, I think, could give them some guidance. The same goes for customer and others. So we're trying to make it as meaningful and relevant to all the stakeholders. And I guess, the jury's out, and it also depends on how good we are at kind of pulling it together and collaborating with other education institutions, industry, nonprofit foundations, to what extent we could make this somewhat mainstream. And I think that's part of a longer term vision. And this is something that is a decade-long project. So we're just at the infancy of that. But your point is right on, in terms of how do we bring some clarity around ESG world, but then also new entrants like SBI, how does it play a role?
Thanks for that, Rashid. And thanks, Rob. Thanks, Chris, and others for questions. That was a lovely conversation to have. And Hassan, we wish you well with your research. And it doesn't make a meaningful difference if you get it somewhere right. So good luck with that.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And, Carolina, you could tell us what to do next.
I think, did we upload Rashad? I think I
we didn't.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, also thank you all for those who are keeping the camera on. I really love seeing the diversity in the room. It's really heartwarming. So thank you so much for being with us. So yes, there's actually a surprise because we had only 3 presentations scheduled for this session. So we actually have a few more minutes to ask any more questions that you might have or comments while we wait for the break to start. So we will be finishing at 5.
Okay, so we've got a few more thoughts. So maybe I could start off just building on the last discussion. So in South Africa, we have something called integrated reporting. And we had this, it's legislated in South Africa. So every company that's listed has to produce one as part of its legitimacy as being audited. And what we found was that some companies were like, hiring companies to do a really glossy finished book to demonstrate their management of all the capitals in their business. And when we had a mining disaster for one of the companies, it was rated very highly as winning an integrated reporting award. We came up with a measure for measuring the level of integrated thinking in an organization. And I'll share that research with you, Rashid, or anyone else who wants it. I think it kind of gets to the heart of the challenge of how do we do this with the reporting mechanisms that are out there and artificial intelligence mechanisms to give us some estimate of this this important engagement process. So yeah, I'll share it with you. If you just drop me an email address in the chat, I'll make sure I'll get it to you.
Yes,
Other
you can
thoughts?
also send it to me, Rashid, so that we can include it in the report that will go out after the colloquium.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I mean, these are in the US, for example, right? Mostly, many of the standards are driven by non-public entities. So, for example, NASDAQ basically said, if you don't have a female board member, then it can't be listed. That's just one example of where institutions are kind of pushing the agenda a little bit. But, I think SBI even goes further saying, is one female board member adequate, right? I mean, it should be 50-50. I mean, if we look at that, right? But, how do you get there? And the question becomes, where do you start? Where do you set the standard? So some of the standards are going to be based on census. So SBI looks at, the company board profile and say, if you don't have 50-50, then you're not really being gender equitable. So we have kind of, in a way, take some positions in framing the SBI in the way we feel is equitable. But, again, these are debatable issues, interesting challenges and conversation to have.
Indeed, indeed. Cynthia, please go ahead with your contribution.
Yeah, when it comes to stakeholders engagement, and even when it comes to ED agenda aspect of it, intersectionality with race, we have issues because companies are supposed to be doing this on their own. Are we calling for legislation? Because even when you look at the UK and you look at ethnicity pay gap, there is no legislation around it. I've been campaigning for legislation so that they have to be monitored. They have to send feedback on it, which has not been done. Where are we going from here? People want to be seen as doing sustainability, but they actually don't do it. So if you look at the reporting index, what do you see when it comes to intersectionality, gender intersectionality with race? And that's for Hassan.
So in our SBI metrics, when you look at the employee as sort of one of the stakeholder, right? We look at gender equity, we look at racial equity in the employee pool. We look at the board membership, and so for example, in the US, the census says 13% of US population is African American. So we're basically saying in the board, then at least 13% of the board members should be African American, right? That's the standard we have set for the SBI, internally, based on what do you think is equitable. But most of the, I would say, most of the Fortune 100 companies don't measure up to that. So, and in the US, there's civil rights acts that has been passed, right? So one could use some of those legislation to at least push for this agenda. So to the extent, and that's one of the reasons we also have faculty from law school, public policy, and others to giving us some guidance where, are there existing legislature that enhance some of the position we're taking in the SBI? And if not, why should we advocate for policy discussion and conversations? And we're right outside of DC, so that makes it a little bit easier for us to connect with the lawmakers and have those conversations face to face, and that's really helpful.
And when it comes to the Fortune 100 or companies, now when it comes to the local, even our education sector, right? We talk about the fact that we are pushing the agenda forward. However, some of them still don't understand it. They think, I was talking about gender intersectionality with race. So instead of having a female person of ethnicity or color, they would rather bring a male perpetuating the same dominance of male at the top when the female is still underrepresented. And they think they are doing gender balance. It is not. It's something that we need to look at. Is it the format for reporting that needs to be changed? Is it the policies that needs to be changed? These are key things that we have to engage in. I'm doing a research on EDI leadership. I call it equity rather than equality, because when it comes to equality, there are people already, I was just teaching and using it at 50%, somebody's at 10%. When you talk about equality, if I give 10% to 50%, 60, and I give 10% to 10%, 20, we are still not equal. But then when we talk about equity, it means that I have to bring 10% to 50, as you said, 50-50 before the split. Now, it's imperative that we look at how we measure it, how key indicators such as this are measured, because it's not working. I'm looking at leadership. And when I looked at all the universities in the UK, I'm doing work on leadership and EDI, strategic leadership, how to influence. What I can see is that anybody who puts Athena Swan, female, 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 but we have 9 protected characteristics which are not being incorporated. And even within the 9 protected characteristics, which one is really key at the moment? We talk about race, intersectionality with gender, intersectionality with disability. These are not being done.
Right. I mean, I would even say, so in our thinking on the SBI, like, let's assume for the sake of argument that, okay, we have the gender equity, like 50-50, you have the African-American or people of color. But if everybody in the board still think about shareholder primacy, then we don't have really representation of all the stakeholders, right? So it has to be much more deeper than just what's on the surface. And that's another challenge that I think we haven't even really talked about, because I'm advocating that in the board member, every board member has to have some orientation for a particular stakeholders. Right? Who is really looking after for the employees in the board? Who is really talking about the community in the board? Right now, we don't have, you have a very monolithic people who are CEOs of other companies. They have similar experiences. It's all about profit motivation. So even if you have those equity in the gender and racial, unless the mindset is different, nothing's going to change.
Thanks, Rashid. Thanks, Cynthia. I think it's very much a work in progress, but nevertheless, inspiring work in progress. So with that, I want to bring this session to a close. And I want to thank our presenters and discussants in the room for a very lively discussion that was informative.
Thank you so much. I will stop